Welcome to another episode of my jig and fly tying series, Vise Principles, and today's jig pattern might be the easiest one that I've come up with so far, but it also might be one of the coolest. And these babies right here are the reason that this jig pattern is so cool, and surely I'm not the only person that saw these on the shelves and thought, I'm gonna tie a jig on that. I'm calling today's jig pattern the Pulse Dragon, which is also probably the coolest name that I've come up with thus far. And this jig has a ton of action, it creates a ton of disturbance in the water, and once again, it is super duper easy to tie. Alright guys, today we're going to be tying on the 1/8 ounce Pulse Jig in Pearl White. And let me tell you, I've been throwing some swim baits around in the rivers with this thing, and the bass, and especially the northern pike, hate this thing. They viciously attack the Pulse Jig. And I'm not sponsored by Pulse Fish Lures. I don't get anything for telling you guys about this, but I'm always going to share with you guys the stuff that I use and that's working for me. And I've been fishing this almost like a finesse alternative to the chatterbait, and it has been absolutely lights out. The thread I'm going to be using today is Danville's 210 denier flat waxed nylon in white color. And I'll be putting links to the jig heads, the thread, and the other materials that we're going to be using today down in the description. To get started, we're going to lay down a base layer of thread down the hook shank to the start of the hook's bend. Next, we're going to tie in the tail, and for that, I'm going to be using Mangum's UV treated 4-inch micro dragon tail in white color. So now I'm going to take my tail here and line that up on the top of the hook shank, and I'm going to use the full length of the tail. And I'm just going to tie that in right where I stopped my thread. And this is going to make our pattern about 6 inches in length, and you could definitely shorten that up if you wanted to, just by plucking some of the fibers out of the first section of the tail here and tying it in a little bit further up the tail. But the design of the Pulse Jig head allows you to fish this really slow, and I have absolutely not had any problems with short strikes. Those pike have been inhaling this bait, so I'm going to be using the full length of the tail. So we'll just line our tail up here on the top of the hook shank, and then I'm going to tie that in with a couple tight wraps. Next, I'll make 2 tight wraps just in front of this little appendage on the front, and then I'm going to move my thread up to the front of the jig head right behind this little piece of metal here. Then I'll position this little tie-in point appendage here on top of the hook shank, and I'm going to capture that at the front with another couple tight wraps. And now I'm going to wrap my thread back to the base of the tail using tight wraps to really secure that in place. And now it's time for the body, and for that we're going to be using a cross-cut rabbit strip in white color by Hairline. The first thing we want to do with our rabbit strip is to pluck the hairs from the first 1/2 inch of that hide. Next, I'm going to tie in my 1/2 inch bare section of hide top side down to the hook shank. Once my rabbit strip has been tied in, I'm going to move my thread up to the front of the jig head and then get that out of the way using my bobbin holder. Next, I'm going to lay down a line of super glue along the hook shank, and then I'm going to wrap my cross-cut rabbit strip around the hook shank with the hair oriented toward the tail all the way up to the front of the jig head, and then I'll tie that off. And now I'll just make a few additional wraps just to secure the end of that rabbit strip. Alright, this next part is entirely optional, but I like to cover up my exposed thread whenever I have the chance, and we're going to do that with a rabbit hair dubbing loop. So first I'm just going to capture 1 to 2 inches of rabbit hair using my Loon material tweezers. After capturing that hair, I'm then going to trim it away from the hide using my scissors. After I trim that hair away from the hide, I'm then going to form a 3 to 4 inch dubbing loop right where my thread begins. And then I'm going to move my thread up to the front of the jig head and get that out of the way using my bobbin holder. And now I'm going to secure that dubbing loop using my Smain Master dubbing twister. Then I'll add a bit of dubbing wax to that dubbing loop just to help hold that hair in place. Then I will carefully insert my rabbit hair into the dubbing loop. And that rabbit hair should be positioned in the dubbing loop just about like this, about 1/4 inch away from the base of the hair. And now we'll go ahead and spin up that rabbit hair. And now I'm going to use my dubbing brush just to free up any trapped hairs, and then we're going to wrap this up to the front of the jig head and tie it off. And to finish up here, I'm going to perform a 3-turn whip finish, followed by a 5-turn whip finish. Alright guys, here we are, the Pulse Dragon. Just a super unique jig pattern on a very cool jig head. The Pulse Jig head just has a ton of movement. We have the flowy, pulsating rabbit hairs up front, this crazy limber tail here, the dragon tail in the back, and that jig head that creates that side-to-side wobble that drives the fish absolutely nuts. I fish for pike pretty often, and I'm telling you guys, outside of the whopper plopper, I have never seen pike hit a lure harder than they hit the Pulse Jig. Alright guys, that's going to do it for the video, and I hope you did enjoy it. I am already planning to tie up some more of the Pulse Dragons in different color variations. I'm thinking about some fire tiger, some all black, some black and orange, some red and white, a lot of the color patterns that really seem to catch the northern pike. I'm also thinking about adding some rubber legs, maybe converting it into an underspin. There's just so much that you can do with this pattern, but the key is that Pulse Jig. That jig head creates some incredible action in the water that generates a ton of strikes. And as I have been doing with all of the jig patterns that I've tied up thus far, I'm going to be putting some Pulse Dragons into my 100 jig giveaway. And if you want to be eligible to win 100 of my custom hand-tied jigs, all you have to do now is subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you get notified when the giveaway goes live. Thank you guys for taking time out of your day to watch my video, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, bye.